What happens when the woman who spent her whole life giving, cooking, sewing, raising, waiting, realizes she was never invited, only expected? This is the story of Helen Whitaker, a grandmother who thought Thanksgiving was about coming home, until she arrived and realized her room was temporary, her stay scheduled, and her presence tolerated, not treasured. Packed with only a jar of peach jam and stitched memories, Helen walked away from the family who saw her as a helper, not a human being, and toward a life of her own making. From the silence of an assisted living hallway to the noisy joy of a craft market. From a fold-out cot in her son's living room to a booth proudly bearing her name. Helen's journey is a love letter to every woman who's been taken for granted and who finally chooses herself. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered if it's too late to begin again, this story is for you. Stay. Watch. You won't forget her. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, subscribe to hear how the story unfolds, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. Your support keeps these voices alive. A seat at the table, but not a place to belong. Helen Whitaker had always believed that Thanksgiving meant going home, even if that home hadn't truly felt like hers in a very long time. That year, her son, Stephen, insisted on picking her up from the assisted living center himself. He said his son Ethan was off school for the holiday and really missed Grandma Helen. There was warmth in his voice, but something clipped at the edges, like he was reciting from a list of things good sons were supposed to say. "It's good to see you a little early," he added, as she climbed into the car, clutching a soft bag that held all she thought she might need: a thin lavender cardigan, 2 jars of her homemade peach jam, and a little turkey ornament she'd stitched from old fabric scraps she'd saved over the years. When they arrived at the house in the suburbs, Melissa opened the door with a smile that barely grazed her lips. "The guest room's ready. You'll just be here for a couple of nights," she said, stepping aside. Helen nodded, stepping inside to a house that smelled like cinnamon candles and floor cleaner. The smell was familiar, but sterile. Ethan came bounding down the stairs, his face lighting up as he saw her. "Grandma!" He hugged her tightly, and for a moment, his small arms around her shoulders felt like sunlight cracking through a frosted window. On the dining table, a steaming turkey rested on a platter, surrounded by perfectly arranged dishes: green beans with slivered almonds, a sweet potato casserole with marshmallows, and 3 kinds of pie. It all looked like something from a magazine spread. Helen helped Ethan cut his meat, listened to his silly jokes about school, and nodded along as Stephen talked about new infrastructure projects in the city. Every now and then, Melissa interrupted to correct his word choices, her tone polite but cool. Everything seemed to glide along fine, until Ethan suddenly turned to her and asked with childlike honesty, "Grandma, when are you leaving?" Before she could answer, Stephen replied casually, "Tomorrow." He said it like she was a traveler, catching a bus out of town, not his mother, who had once held him through croup and stitched his soccer socks back together after 100 backyard games. Melissa kept slicing potatoes without missing a beat. "We only cleared the guest room for 2 nights, she added, her voice flat. Helen's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Stephen cleared his throat, looking embarrassed, but said nothing. He reached for his wine glass instead. "Stephen," Melissa added, "you really should have confirmed the dates with me. I only found out yesterday that you invited Helen. You know how tight the schedule gets before the holidays." She said it like they were talking about reserving a meeting room at work, not welcoming family. Helen looked down at her plate. Suddenly, the turkey seemed too rich, the green beans too cold. "Okay," Stephen said stiffly. "I'll take you back after lunch tomorrow. Traffic should be light." Helen simply nodded, swallowing not food, but disappointment. After dinner, she stood automatically to clear the dishes. No one stopped her. No one offered to help. The cabinets seemed higher than she remembered. She had to rise on her toes just to put away the dessert plates. Moonlight streamed in through the kitchen window, casting a pale sheen on her dry hands, wrinkled, veined, and tired. The scent of roasted squash mixed with dish soap filled the air. From the living room she heard Melissa saying, I reorganized the kitchen storage while she was here again. Stephen let out a grunt, not agreement, not disagreement, just indifference. Helen stood in the kitchen alone, listening to their voices talk about her like she was an object, an item to be rearranged, a suitcase to be packed away. Melissa soon entered the kitchen, placing a sealed container next to the sink. "Take this with you," she said. "It's low sodium." Low sodium, like her, mild, muted, safe, easy to manage. Helen said nothing. The kitchen went quiet. She sat at the table and looked down at her hands, hands that once cradled babies, stitched together tears in shirts and marriages alike, cooked meals from scratch, and soothed fevered brows. Now they held nothing but stillness. Later that night, Ethan ran into her room and proudly handed her a crinkled sheet of paper, his handprint painted like a turkey. "Grandma, this is for you. You have to put it on your fridge." She kissed his forehead and folded the drawing gently into her bag. She slept lightly that night. Somewhere after midnight, she crept down the stairs for a glass of water and froze as she heard murmured voices from Stephen and Melissa's bedroom. "Are you really taking her back tomorrow?" Melissa asked. "Yeah," Stephen replied, voice low. "I don't think she wants to stay long anyway." "Well, next time don't spring this on me last minute, okay? Thanksgiving is stressful enough already." Helen didn't listen to the rest. She turned on the faucet, letting cold water run over her fingers. It felt like it was running through her chest, sharp, chilly, hollow. She stood in that kitchen, realizing something she should have seen sooner. She hadn't really been invited. She'd been scheduled. The goodbye that didn't need words. The next morning, Helen was already dressed before sunrise. Her soft brown coat was buttoned up, and her travel bag, light but full of meaning, rested by her side like an old companion. When Stephen came down the stairs, coffee in hand and car keys jingling from his fingers, he blinked at the sight of her waiting silently by the door. "You're not waiting until after lunch?" he asked, caught off guard. Helen smiled gently, her voice calm and measured. "Didn't you say the schedule was tight before the holiday?" He said nothing, just opened the door. The car ride was quiet. Stephen tuned the radio to a news station, but the words blended into the soft hum of tires on pavement. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, like someone had drawn a curtain over the sun. As they pulled into the circular driveway of Maple Creek Assisted Living, Helen's chest tightened. The sliding glass doors opened automatically, releasing a faint scent of lemon disinfectant and old carpet. Behind the reception desk, Doris looked up with a tired smile. "Back so soon, Mrs. Whitaker." Helen nodded, forcing her lips into something that resembled a smile. Stephen didn't linger. He gave a half-hearted, "I'll call later," then disappeared without looking back. As the doors shut behind him, Helen stood still for a moment, gripping the handle of her bag. Back in her room, nothing had changed. The beige curtains drooped in their usual tired folds. The Halloween sticker Ethan had put up weeks ago, a pumpkin-shaped cat in a witch's hat, still clung crookedly to the door. She placed the jars of peach jam deep into the drawer and gently slid Ethan's turkey drawing over them. And then, without warning, she felt it, a deep, quiet ache, not the kind that screams or sobs, but the kind that folds itself neatly and disappears into corners. That afternoon, she showed up to the book club in the activity room, just like always. They were reading The Kite Runner, but no one really discussed it. Each woman took turns, reading a few pages aloud, voices flat and slow. When it was Helen's turn, she read with practiced composure, but her mind was elsewhere, on a little boy's painted handprint, on a guest room with a ticking clock, on words said behind closed doors. She glanced down at the motivational bookmark tucked between the pages. It read, "Age is just a number." She wanted to laugh or cry, maybe both. Later that week, she joined the knitting group again, not for the love of yarn or color, but for the rhythm. Loop, pull, tighten, loop, pull, tighten. It was something to do. Across the table, Ethel glanced at her work. "You've got a nice tension there," she said softly. Helen nodded without answering. Lunch that day was the usual: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. A small placard read, "Low sodium meal." She stared at it for a long time. The words didn't just describe the food. They described her: muted, software, manageable. At 3:30, they wheeled out the TV in the activity room for the daily movie, that day's choice, The Wizard of Oz. Helen sat in the back row, watching Dorothy click her heels and whisper, "There's no place like home." Her eyes welled up. Because this place? This wasn't home. That night, she woke around 2:30 a.m., as she always did. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fan spun in lazy circles overhead, slow, steady, merciless. She counted the insulin shots she'd taken that day. 2. She thought about the aides who had spoken to her. 3. None had called her Helen, just ma'am. The next day, on the bulletin board near the activity room, she saw it, in loving memory of Jeanette M., passed peacefully on Tuesday morning. Jeanette. She had sat 2 seats down in knitting group, always used bright yellow yarn, always hummed under her breath. Her seat stayed empty for a day. By the next, someone else had filled it. Doris logged it in the daily care report, room 213, ready for reassignment. That line hit Helen harder than the obituary ever could, typed neatly, filed away, like Jeanette was just a space to be refilled. That night, Helen sat by the window holding a mug of lukewarm milk. It tasted like nothing, and she laughed, a bitter, hollow sound, because this place, this life, wasn't hurting her. It was numbing her, keeping her safe, sure, but also keeping her quiet, obedient, invisible. She reached into the drawer and unfolded Ethan's painting, the handprint turkey. Then she pulled out her sewing kit. Her hands trembled more than they used to, but the curve of the needle still felt familiar. The scraps of fabric, the last pieces of color she had any control over, were all she had. And something inside her stirred. She didn't know where she would go, didn't know if anyone would catch her, but if she stayed here, folded neatly, like Jeanette, then one day her name would be typed up in bold and reassigned to someone else's room. She couldn't let that happen. Not yet. The first step was leaving. Without telling anyone that entire week, Helen moved like a ghost, still attending the book club, still nodding politely at the nurses, still folding her clothes with precision, but inside, her mind was already somewhere else. She didn't tell anyone she wanted to leave, not Doris at the front desk, not Mrs. Carmichael, her next-door neighbor, who always asked if she'd seen her slippers, not even the woman who ran the knitting group, because deep down, Helen wasn't sure anyone would care enough to stop her. Her plan, if you could even call it that, was simple. Pack lightly, bring her sewing kit, take a bus out of town. Anywhere was better than being parked in a room waiting to expire quietly. That morning, she put on her warmest cardigan and packed 2 pouches she had stitched herself. Each one was lined with soft flannel, scraps from an old nightgown that once belonged to her mother. She stood by the mirror for a moment. Her reflection stared back, hair neatly combed, lips pressed in a straight line, eyes alert. "I still look like me," she whispered. "And that's a start." She slipped out through the automatic doors like a breeze. No one stopped her. No alarms went off. No missing persons call was made. And somehow, that hurt more than being told to go. At the bus station, she looked up at the glowing screen displaying destinations. Riverbend, Lancaster, Roseville. Roseville, she thought. It sounded soft, like flowers or memories. She bought a one-way ticket with a few crumpled bills and coins from the bottom of her handbag. The ride was bumpy, the windows fogged over, the seats smelled like old fries, but for the first time in years, Helen didn't care, because no one was waiting for her, and no one was watching. When the bus pulled into the little town center of Roseville, it was nearly dusk. She stepped off with her bag in hand, squinting at the fading light. There was a motel just down the block, Maple Breeze Inn. The sign flickered, and the siding was chipped, but the door locked from the inside, and the room had a small window. That was enough. She checked in with Cash. Room 6. No questions asked. The room smelled like old pine cleaner and something faintly burnt, but she didn't mind. She had a bed, she had a chair, she had quiet. She laid her sewing kit on the desk and stared at it. Everything she had left was in that box. Spools of thread, worn scissors, thimbles, buttons saved from clothes no one wore anymore. She made tea with the motel's battered kettle and opened the curtain. Outside, the wind rustled the dry leaves and she whispered, "I'm still here." That night, for the first time in a long time, Helen slept, not because she was tired, but because she wasn't afraid. The next morning, a stitch in the sunlight peeked in through the cracked curtain and painted warm slants across the beige motel bedspread. Helen pulled her chair by the window, took out her needles and thread, and started to sew. Not for money, not for anyone's gratitude, just to feel something take shape under her hands. By noon, she had made 2 fabric pouches, one red, one navy, each with simple embroidery, a single flower. She set them on the table beside her teacup and stared at them. They weren't much, but they were hers. Around 2 o'clock, a woman in an orange coat walked by the motel and paused. She glanced toward the window where Helen sat sewing. Their eyes met. Then the woman turned and came toward the room. Helen's heart fluttered. Was this trouble? Had someone reported her missing? But the woman just smiled and asked, "You made that?" nodding toward the pouch in Helen's lap. Helen nodded. "It's lovely," the woman said, her voice light and kind. "I run a gift boutique in the next town. We're always looking for handmade items like that." Helen blinked. You really think someone would want this?" The woman nodded. "Absolutely, especially with the holidays coming." She handed Helen a card. "Send a few samples to this address. If my buyer likes them, I'll be in touch." Before Helen could say thank you, the woman was gone, coat fluttering behind her, coffee cup still in hand. Helen looked down at the card in her lap. The name of the shop was embossed in gold, The Kind Nest. She felt something flicker in her chest, not quite joy, but the beginning of it. That night, Helen stitched 2 more pouches, one lined with pale yellow silk from a dress she wore once to Stephen's high school graduation. She wrapped them carefully, packed them in a padded envelope, and mailed them the next morning. She couldn't remember the last time she had sent something that wasn't a bill or a birthday card. Back in her room, she waited 3 days, then 4. And on the 5th day, she walked to the post office. The clerk frowned at the address. "That building's been empty for almost a year," he said. "Nothing's been picked up there in months." Helen's knees nearly buckled. She had been scammed. It wasn't the money. It was the hope, the small flicker she let in, the idea that someone still wanted what she had to offer. She went back to her room, sat on the bed, and stared at her sewing kit. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She called her son. "Stephen," her voice shook. I just needed to hear a voice I knew." He sounded surprised. "Where are you?" "I left Maple Creek," she said. "I tried to live on my own. I tried to sell my pouches, but I got scammed." A pause. Then his voice turned cool. "Mom, you should have told me. I'm not even in town. Call the home. Have them come get you." And then he hung up. Helen didn't cry. She didn't even get angry. She just stared at the phone, her hand still holding it long after the line had gone silent. Then she looked at her pouches, each one stitched with trembling fingers and the memory of someone who used to be needed. "I won't go back," she whispered, even if she had nowhere else to go. A stranger with silver hair and a coffee cup. The next morning, Helen returned to the same bench across from the motel, not because she had a plan, but because she didn't know where else to go. The wind tugged at the hem of her cardigan, and the pouch she tried to sew felt clumsy in her hands. Her fingers trembled more now. The scam had shaken something loose inside her. She sat quietly, thread barely sliding through the needle, eyes on the ground. She thought she might just sit there until the air turned dark again. Then, without warning, someone sat on the opposite side of the bench, worn leather jacket, messy silver hair, a red scarf looped around her neck like it had stories of its own. The woman set a steaming coffee cup on the armrest between them and said, "Those are nice stitches." Helen blinked. She hadn't expected to hear a voice. The woman didn't push, didn't ask questions. She simply sipped her coffee, legs crossed, eyes following a squirrel that darted by. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, the woman stood and said, "You coming back tomorrow?" Helen hesitated, then nodded, just once. The woman smiled. "I'll bring some scraps. Let's see who stitches faster." Then she walked away. The next day, silver hands, steady threads. Helen returned. Part of her thought it had all been a dream, but there she was. Same jacket, different scarf, same coffee. She handed Helen a bundle of colorful fabric and introduced herself. "Name's Joan. I like sewing and strong coffee. You?" "Helen," she said softly. "I used to work in textiles." Joan let out a whistle. "Well, that explains it. That corner stitch? Factory tight." Helen chuckled for the first time in days. They stitched in silence. Then Joan added, "You know what's worse than being old and ignored?" Helen looked up. "Being treated like you're already finished." The words pierced deeper than Helen expected. Joan nodded, reading her silence. "I got divorced at 62. My ex said I was too old to start over, so I moved into my sister's attic, learned how to quilt, and started teaching kids at the community center. Now I run the whole sewing circle and fix the coffee machine when it acts up." Helen stared. "You do all that?" Joan shrugged. "You either fold up and wait, or you stitch yourself back together." She pulled a flyer from her bag and slid it over to Helen. In bold blue letters, it read, "Silver Hands Club, because we're not done yet." Helen stared at the tagline. It felt like an invitation from a version of herself she hadn't met yet. "You coming?" Joan asked. Helen wanted to say no. She wasn't ready, but her fingers folded the flyer carefully and tucked it into her bag. And the next day, she showed up. The Silver Hands Club, finding home without a house. The community center was an old brick building with ivy crawling up its sides. Inside, it smelled like laundry detergent and peppermint tea. There were tables scattered with colorful thread, scraps of cloth, and pincushions shaped like tomatoes. 8 women sat chatting, stitching, teasing each other. Joan let Helen in like she was royalty. "Ladies," she announced, "this is Helen. Watch her stitch. She's factory grade." Heads turned. One woman waved. Another slid a chair over. Helen sat, and when she made her first stitch, something inside her unclenched. Not everything, but something. The women didn't ask why she was there. They didn't probe about family. They only talked about patterns, thread colors, and whose machine made the most noise. By the end of the day, Helen had made 4 neat pouches. As she packed them away, Joan whispered, "These could sell, you know." Helen shook her head. "No one wants old lady scraps." Joan stared at her. "You're not rejecting the market. You're rejecting yourself." Helen didn't answer, but the words sat with her that night, heavier than they should have been. The spark of a project, Granny's hands. The 3rd time Helen showed up, Joan brought her granddaughter, Eliza, mid-20s, baseball cap, a denim jacket covered in enamel pins. She was carrying a camera and looked like she had ideas swirling behind her eyes. "This is Helen," Joan said proudly. "She's a legend with a needle." Eliza snapped a few photos and asked gently, "You selling these?" Helen shook her head. "Just gifts. For fun." Eliza smiled. "What if someone wanted to buy them?" Helen shrugged. "Why would they?" Eliza sat beside her, eyes bright. "Because every stitch tells a story, and people don't just want things, they want meaning." And just like that, the idea was born. They called it Granny's Hands. Eliza built the website. Helen stitched 10 pouches. Each one had a small tag, handmade by Helen, with care, not clock. They uploaded the photos, a short bio, and Eliza added a little video. Helen stitching by the window, fingers steady, eyes soft, her voice saying, "I used to make these for people I loved. Now I make them for anyone who needs a piece of warmth in their hands. Helen expected nothing, but within 48 hours, they sold out. People commented, "Reminds me of my grandma." Finally, something made by a human. I cried reading her little handwritten card. Helen held the screen in her lap, tears pooling behind her eyes, not because she was famous, but because she was finally seen. The return of the familiar. 3 weeks after Granny's Hands launched, Helen's pouches had shipped to over 100 customers across the country. Each pouch included a small, handwritten card. Not poetry, not profound quotes, just little thoughts. Rain today, perfect for tea and stitches. Saw a robin on the windowsill, first one this winter. My fingers ache, but my heart's content. People loved the cards. One customer posted, "I didn't just get a pouch, I got a piece of someone's quiet world." Another said, "She reminded me of my grandma, but also of myself one day." And that's when the phone rang. Helen was sitting in her motel room, stitching a new batch of pouches when the screen lit up. "David," she stared for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice was soft, rehearsed. She could hear something in it, a hesitation, a need. "We need to talk," he began. "There have been layoffs. Jenna and we're struggling. The mortgage, Ben's school expenses. It's been hard." Silence. Helen didn't say a word, just listened. David continued, "We know you've always been careful with money. We thought maybe, just maybe, you could help. A little." A little. Helen looked around her room. The motel bed, the sewing kit, the roll of shipping labels on her table. Everything she'd built, not for anyone else, but for herself. And now, once again, someone wanted to take. "David," she said, voice calm but solid, "what you need isn't help. What you need is to face reality." He was quiet. She took a breath and said, "I've been your backup plan for too long. I'm not angry, but I don't want to live that way anymore." And then gently, she hung up. The boundary that held. That night, Helen didn't cry. Instead, she folded a pouch slowly, stitched her initials into the corner, and placed it in the ready-to-ship basket. She didn't tell Joan, didn't tell Eliza. It wasn't a story she needed to share, not yet. But the next day, David and Jenna showed up. They stood at her motel door, eyes weary, clothes wrinkled in a way that said they hadn't slept well in days. "We didn't know where else to go," Jenna whispered. "We're sorry." Helen looked at them, not with anger, not even with disappointment, just with truth. "You shouldn't treat me like a solution," she said. "I'm not your answer." David opened his mouth. "Can you help? One more time?" Helen's voice didn't waver. "I can, but not as your lifeline. You'll have to carry your own weight this time." Something shifted in David's face. Not relief, not resistance. Maybe understanding. He nodded. "I think I get it now." Helen stood, opened the fridge, and said, "Sit down. I'll make something warm." They ate in silence. Then they left. No long goodbye. No promises. Just quiet respect. And Helen watched them go, standing straighter than she had in years. The garden bench apology. A few days later, David returned, alone. He didn't knock on the motel door this time. He waited at the community center's garden bench, the same one Helen had sat on when her hands were trembling from the scam. Helen walked out, apron still tied around her waist. He stood. "I'm here to apologize," he said. "Not for money, not to ask for anything, just to say I'm sorry." Helen waited. He looked at her, eyes sincere. "When I was a kid, I thought your love was just part of the furniture, always there, always silent. I never saw the person behind it." Helen didn't speak. She didn't need to. He looked away, then back. "Now, I see her, and I want to get to know her, the real you, if you'll let me." Helen nodded once. "You can visit," she said, "but I'm not coming back." David didn't flinch. "I understand." And just before he turned to leave, she added, "Next time, don't bring a problem." Bring a cup of coffee. He smiled. This time it reached his eyes. The rise of Granny's hands. That night, Eliza burst into Helen's room. Maggie, your grandson is going viral. What? Eliza held up her phone. A video played. Ben, holding up one of Helen's pouches in a classroom. This, my grandma made it. She's kind of famous now. The comments flooded in. Where do I buy? I'd give anything for one. Her hands remind me of my mom's. Helen's chest swelled, not from ego, but from something deeper, pride, joy, and, finally, peace. The first flight of a quiet bird. The night before her flight, Helen couldn't sleep. She'd packed her modest suitcase 4 times already, each time folding and refolding the same 3 cardigans, her best brooch, and 20 handmade pouches. Each pouch had a stitched tag that read, Granny's Hands, stitched with soul. Joan had given her the final push. You've got to go, Maggie. That's not just any booth. It's a window. Eliza had been buzzing with excitement all week. An arts festival, Grandma, West Coast. You'll be face to face with people who aren't there out of duty. They'll be there because they admire you. Helen wasn't so sure. What would she even say? What if her hands trembled too much? What if she looked like someone's great aunt who wandered in by mistake? But as she zipped her bag for the last time, she caught a glimpse of her old sewing kit and whispered to herself, if not now, when? Flying above the map, the next morning, Eliza met her at the airport. She wore a blazer covered in enamel pins, her hair pulled into a bun, phone in hand, and eyes scanning the boarding screens like a soldier on a mission. Ready? She asked. Helen smiled, nervous but grounded. I think so. It had been decades since Helen had even considered air travel. The last time she'd been on a plane, her husband was alive and the stewardess wore gloves. Now, here she was, wheeling her own carry-on bag like a first-time backpacker. When the plane took off, Helen pressed her hand to the window. The world below shrank until every street, every house, even every memory looked like part of someone else's story. The clouds opened above her, and for the first time, she didn't feel old. She felt untethered, free. A booth with her name. The festival was hosted in a seaside city full of steep streets, murals, and coffee shops with windows that never closed. Eliza led the way, their booth tucked into a sunny corner of the outdoor gallery. On the table, they laid out Helen's pouches. They arranged each one with care. Each pouch carried a story. Some were sewn from old denim, some from tablecloths Helen had kept from her first apartment. Every single one had a heartbeat inside it. Above the table, Eliza taped a hand-painted sign, Granny's Hands. Every stitch, a story. People stopped, some to look, some to smile, some to cry. A young woman with purple streaks in her hair picked up a floral pouch and whispered, My Nana taught me to sew. She passed last year. This feels like her. A man in a suit bought 3 and said, I don't need them, but I needed this. Helen didn't talk much. She didn't sell. She simply was, and somehow that was enough. A spotlight she never asked, for near the end of the second day, Eliza brought over a woman with a press badge. This is Kelly. She's from the local paper. She wants to feature you. Helen blinked. Me? Kelly nodded. You've become a quiet sensation. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? Helen hesitated. I'm not good with speeches. You don't need to be, Kelly said. Just tell me, why do you sew? Helen looked down at the pouch in her hands. She smoothed the stitches, looked at the crowd walking by, and then said, Because when you're old, the world starts treating you like you're already done. But I'm not done. These stitches are me saying, I'm still here. Kelly didn't ask another question. She just scribbled something in her notebook, patted Helen's hand, and walked away. One small whisper echoed. Far that night, back in the hotel room, Helen sat by the window and watched the Pacific Ocean shimmer in the distance. The wind outside carried voices, songs, seagulls. It was all so alive. On the table next to her lay a stack of receipts, a pouch half sewn, and a single business card with a handwritten note. "We'd love to carry your work year-round. Let us know." Helen picked up the pouch and stitched the last seam. Then, in the corner, she added something new. A small, looping H inside a sunburst, her maker's mark. It was her signature now. The letter with no stamp 3. Days after returning from the West Coast, Helen found herself back at the community center, unpacking a new set of floral fabric she'd bought at a street market near the ocean. Her fingers moved slower now, not because she was tired, but because she was savoring each stitch. Every loop and knot was different now. She wasn't sewing to pass the time. She was sewing for something, for someone. And then, something unexpected arrived. A small envelope tucked between her thread spools in the club's supply cubby. No stamp, no return address. Just her name in careful, wobbly cursive, Grandma. She opened it slowly, careful not to rip the paper. Inside was a folded note in blue ink. "Dear Grandma, in school, they asked us to write about someone we admire. I wanted to pick someone famous, but then I thought, my grandma is famous. You make things with your hands that people love. You have your own shop. People clap for you. That's cool. Can you come to my school next month? My teacher said you can talk to the class about sewing. And also, I miss you. Ben." Helen read it twice, then a third time. Her hand rested on her chest. She had to sit down. It wasn't the request. It wasn't even the word famous. It was the last line. "I miss you." Not because someone told him to write it, not because it was a holiday, but because he meant it. The return visit, when Helen showed up at Ben's school 2 weeks later, she didn't wear anything fancy, just her usual soft cardigan, a pouch slung over her shoulder, and a pair of sturdy walking shoes. The hallway smelled like pencils and cafeteria lunch. It was chaotic, messy, loud, but it was alive. The classroom door swung open and Ben's face lit up like a summer window. "Grandma," he shouted, running up to hug her. His friends gathered around curiously. "This is my grandma, the one with Granny's hands," Helen laughed shyly. "You kids sure make a lady feel like a movie star." Sewing and storytelling. The teacher introduced her, and Helen stood at the front of the room. For a moment she was nervous. She wasn't used to speaking to a room where no one had gray hair. But then she looked at Ben, his eyes wide, his back straight, his chest puffed just a little with pride. And just like that, the fear melted. Helen held up her pouch. "This isn't just fabric," she said. "It's a memory. Every stitch is something I lived through. Some are tight, some are messy, but each one is part of who I am." The room was silent. Even the fidgety boy in the back had gone still. One girl raised her hand. "Did you always know you wanted to sew?" Helen smiled gently. "Number, I just knew I didn't want to disappear. This helped me stay visible, even to myself." The teacher wiped her eyes. Helen didn't notice. She was too busy threading a needle to show the kids how to sew their first button. The quiet apology. After the session, as kids filtered out and the bell rang, David appeared in the doorway. He looked older than Helen remembered, tired in a new kind of way, not from work, but from carrying silence too long. They stood in the hallway, just the two of them. Ben had run off to recess. "I read the article," David said softly. "The one with the photo of you at the festival." Helen didn't answer. She didn't need to. "I didn't know," he added. "I didn't know you had this in you." Helen finally looked up. Her voice was steady. "I always had it. You just stopped looking." David nodded. "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it." Helen didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "You can come to the market next month," she said. "I'll save you a pouch." A place of her own. A week later, Helen signed a rental agreement, a tiny studio apartment above a bakery downtown. It wasn't fancy. It didn't smell like cinnamon candles or disinfectant. It smelled like warm bread and open windows. Eliza helped her move in. Joan brought her a chipped but charming sewing table. Helen laid out her supplies, her fabrics, and finally, her framed card, Granny's hands, stitched with soul. That night, She slept soundly. No whispering voices, no ticking clocks, just her breath, her dreams, and the steady hum of a woman who had stitched herself back together. The booth at the end of the hall. The envelope was pale yellow. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked beneath a flyer for chair yoga and a newsletter from the local senior center. Helen nearly tossed it aside until she saw the return address. American Folk Arts and Crafts Guild, National Showcase Committee. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. The letter was short. Dear Ms. Whitaker, we are thrilled to invite you to participate in the upcoming National Handmade Arts Showcase in Denver, Colorado. Your work, as recommended by a community submission, exemplifies the craftsmanship, storytelling, and cultural heart we aim to highlight this year. Booth B72 is reserved under Granny's Hands. We hope you'll join us. Helen stared at it for a long time. She blinked, then blinked again. Someone out there had nominated her. Without telling her, she turned the letter over. At the bottom, written in purple pen, was a quick note. This is you. Take your thread and fly. Eliza. The journey to Denver. Eliza booked the tickets again. This time, Helen brought more than a sewing kit. She packed a suitcase full of hand-stitched coin purses, pencil rolls, tea cozies, and drawstring bags, all made in her sunlit studio above the bakery. She also brought something else, a framed photo of her old self, the one sitting silently at Maple Creek Assisted Living, forgotten and folded away like last year's cardigan. At the airport, Helen wore her patchwork shawl. It wasn't stylish, but every square had been sewn during a moment of doubt she had survived, and now strangers complimented it in security lines. Where'd you get that? I made it, Helen replied simply. The showcase. The convention center was massive, high ceilings, polished concrete floors, banners fluttering from every corner. Vendors from all over the country had come. Young artists with edgy designs, mothers selling hand-knitted baby clothes, Vietnam veterans with hand-carved wood sculptures, and at the very end of Hall C, just past the coffee stall and near the emergency exit. Booth B72, a simple fold-out table, a pale green tablecloth, and a wooden sign with engraved lettering, Granny's Hands, stitched with sole Helen, laid out her pouches in tidy rows, added her framed card, set out a tiny jar of mints, just like the ones she used to carry in her apron back when she watched Ben after school, and then she waited. The first visitor. It wasn't a customer. It was a woman in her 60s, wearing a vintage denim jacket with frayed cuffs and a bright pink tote. She stopped, tilted her head. Are you the one who makes these? Helen nodded. The woman picked up a pouch and turned it over in her hands. I used to sew, long time ago. Quit after my kids left. Helen said gently, sometimes we don't quit. We just pause. The woman smiled slowly, then bought 2 pouches, and left with eyes a little shinier than when she arrived. A surprise on day 2. By the second day, Helen's booth had a small crowd, not loud, not flashy, but steady. People came because they'd heard of her online. Eliza had quietly posted a clip from their local market with the caption, "She's not here to sell, she's here to share what it means to still matter." One couple drove in from out of town. A young teacher bought a pouch and asked for a photo with Helen, and then Helen spotted a familiar face across the floor, shoulders slumped, tie loose, hands in pockets. David. He walked slowly toward her booth, stopped in front of the table, looked at the pouch with the little stitch tree in the corner. This is beautiful, he said, barely above a whisper. Helen raised her chin. I made it the day you asked for my savings. David winced. He looked up, and this time, he didn't look away. I didn't come to ask for anything, he said. I came to see. She said nothing. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photo. It was of Ben, smiling, holding a pencil case embroidered with little rockets. He talks about you all the time now, says he wants to learn to stitch. Helen allowed a small smile. Tell him to call me, she said. David nodded, and then, like the son he had forgotten how to be, he simply said, I'm proud of you, Mom. The last day of the showcase. Helen's table was almost empty, not because she hadn't brought enough, but because nearly everything had been bought by hands of strangers who somehow felt like old friends. As she packed up the last pouch, a woman in a wheelchair approached. She didn't say much, just pointed at the sign, Granny's Hands. Then she reached out and took Helen's hand. "I'm not a grandma," she whispered, "but thank you for reminding me I don't need to be one to matter." Helen nodded, and in her heart, something unfolded, like a new stitch beginning. A stitch that stays the train back from Denver hummed quietly, the landscape drifting by in a soft blur of autumn gold and harvest brown. Helen Whitaker sat by the window, the box of unsold pouches on her lap. Not many were left, just 3. She'd kept them not out of obligation, but because something about each one felt personal. One stitched with soft gray fabric reminded her of the cardigan she'd worn when she left Maple Creek. Another had buttons from a coat she'd patched for Ben when he was 7. The third had no adornment, just clean, precise stitches. Simple, quiet, like her. Eliza sat beside her, headphones around her neck, tapping on her laptop. But every so often, she'd glance at Helen and smile, never intrusively, just enough to say, "I see you." And that was enough. Back in Roseville, the bakery below Helen's little apartment smelled of cinnamon and cloves. Mrs. Ortega, the owner, had left a small note on her door. "We missed your stories. Come by when you're rested. I saved a cherry Danish." Helen chuckled softly. She climbed the creaky stairs to her tiny home, the curtains still half drawn, the sunlight already beginning its afternoon descent. Her sewing table waited like an old friend, scraps in their usual basket, the pincushion right where she'd left it. Everything was just as she'd left it, except she wasn't. A call from Ben. That evening, while Helen was sorting thread by shade, her phone rang. Ben's name lit up the screen. "Grandma," he said, breathless, "we watched the video at school. My teacher played it for the whole class. Some of the kids clapped." Helen laughed, her eyes crinkling. "You're practically my manager now. I told them you taught me how to fix a button. Everyone was super impressed." There was a pause. Then, quieter, "Grandma, are you coming back for Thanksgiving?" Helen paused. This time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. "I'm not sure yet," she said honestly, "but maybe you and I can make our own plans. Just us." Ben didn't hesitate. "Can we cook pie? I want to make the crust." "We'll make it from scratch," she smiled. "No shortcuts." One final letter. A week later, Helen sat by her window with a cup of tea, the steam curling like silver thread in the air. In her lap was a crisp sheet of paper. She wrote slowly, each word deliberate. "Dear David and Claire, thank you for raising Ben into a boy who still knows how to say 'I miss you.' That tells me you've done something right. I want you to know I forgive you, not because I forget, but because I choose peace over bitterness. I will no longer be the safety net beneath your lives. I will no longer wait in silence to be needed. I'm not angry, just done being invisible. If you'd like to visit me in Roseville, my door is open, not for help, but for coffee and conversation. Sincerely, Helen, your mother, but also someone else now." She folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into her outbox. The Silver Hands market that Sunday, Helen attended her first local market as a seller, not a guest. The town square buzzed with laughter, live music, the scent of kettle corn and roasted chestnuts. Joan arrived, wearing a new scarf Helen had made. "Eliza's working on a documentary about the Silver Hands Club," Joan said, sipping cider. "Apparently, we're a movement." Helen smirked. "Who knew old ladies with needles could be so rebellious?" Joan nudged her. "Oh, we've always been dangerous. They just didn't notice." By noon, all of Helen's pouches had sold. Children pointed at her sign. Adults told her she reminded them of someone they'd lost, or wished they'd known better. No one asked her if she had a room in someone else's house. No one asked her when she was leaving. No one called her low sodium. They just saw her, And that was the miracle. The final thread, back at her sewing table that night, Helen picked up a fresh piece of linen. She threaded her needle, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to rush. No deadline, no favor to return, no guilt pulling at her wrist. She stitched 3 words in the bottom corner. I belong here. Not in a room cleared for 2 nights, not in a schedule rearranged for convenience, not in a silence mistaken for gratitude. Here, in her life, in her hands, in her story. A final reflection for the audience. To those listening, maybe you're a mother, a grandmother, or just someone who spent their life being what others needed. Maybe you've waited for someone to say thank you or I see you, or even just stay. But let me tell you what Helen learned. Your worth is not in what you give. It's in who you are when no one's asking. So if you've ever felt like a guest in your own story, like you were packed up politely and placed in the corners of someone else's life, take a page from Helen, pick up your thread, and start stitching. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Tell us about someone who deserves to be seen. Share this video with someone who's forgotten their own worth. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Because stories like this, stories of quiet strength, late beginnings, and voices rising from silence, deserve to be heard. Always.